everyone. Thank you so much for being here and tuning in. I'm seeing all the participants join us. Just a few welcome words, but we'll dive right into it. My name is Rex Darty. I'm the Artistic Director of Theater Programming at Solas Nua. And everyone at Solas Nua, we are delighted to partner with Global Irish Studies at Georgetown University to host this discussion on female representation in theater and in Ireland and the United States. A special welcome to the students, the faculty, the staff, the alumni from Georgetown and friends of Global Irish Studies, as well as Solas Nua artists and audiences who might be tuning in from wherever you are. Welcome, everybody. You can check out both of our organizations in the chat, which will be running throughout. Solas Nua, which means New Light in Irish, is an award-winning contemporary Irish arts company based in Washington, D.C. We just celebrated our 15th anniversary of bringing the best of modern Irish art to audiences in the United States. And now as we expand to digital platforms to audiences around the world. So thank you for tuning in wherever you are. Our panel today joins us from both sides of the Atlantic, and I am honored to listen and learn from these fantastic theater thinkers, theater makers, theater doers. So thank you all of these fantastic women who are joining us today. A few housekeeping things before we get started. Today's conversation will run about 75 to 90 minutes. You at home, your camera will be off and your microphone will be off for the remainder of the flight. But if you'd like to leave a comment or ask a question, use the Q&A feature. That will be sent to the moderator who can relay the message to the panel. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can, but there's a bunch of folks joining us, so thanks for your patience. And speaking of our moderator, it is my great privilege to introduce Charlotte McIvor. Charlotte is a senior lecturer in drama and deputy head of the School of English and Creative Arts at the National University of Ireland in Galway. She is the author of Migration and Performance in Contemporary Ireland Towards a New Interculturalism, the co-editor of the Methuen Companion to Interculturalism and Performance with Daphne Lay, The Interculturalism and Performance Now, New Directions with Jason King, Devised Performance in Irish Theatre, Histories and Contemporary Practice with Siobhan O'Gorman, and Staging Intercultural Ireland, Plays and Practitioner Perspectives with Matthew Spangler. Charlotte, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Rex, for the invitation to be here today. And also a big thank you to Colleen Parsons from Georgetown University for his invitation to chair this panel and to get to know the brilliant women who are on it with me, who I will be introducing to you over the next 75 minutes, or rather, they will be introducing themselves. I suppose to start, something that I was reflecting on today is that I'm Irish American from Northeast Philadelphia, and I live in Galway, Ireland, where I've lived for almost a decade. I emigrated back to Ireland at exactly the same age that my father emigrated from Ireland to Philadelphia to marry my mother. So I suppose in terms of a person, a woman, a feminist situated at the crossroads of US and Irish culture and theater culture, I suppose Colleen and Rex perhaps asked the right woman, and that particular mix of perspectives that I bring today makes me really excited to moderate this panel with both colleagues that I've known prior to today and also some new colleagues I'm in conversation with for the first time today. So I'll be introducing Jojo, Grace, Deb, and Lian, and actually in the order in which they're listed on the program shortly. What I've asked them to do is to think through some broad points that I came up with in thinking about, okay, what are all of the backgrounds coming here together today? What do we have to say to each other? What do we have to learn from each other? What is the conversation that is possible for an audience where some of you may be Irish folks or folks living in Ireland watching here at 9 p.m. Others may be from the regional Washington, D.C. area or the US more broadly. So we're going to make the attempt as we go through each panelist opening statement to bring everyone up to speed on the basic setup and knowledge about national or regional movements or particularities. But what I'm really hoping for in this conversation is that those sitting on this panel and then in conversation with you, that we'll also have space to dream and think about feminism and gender equality-based art making in ways that are open-ended, as well as informational, and that we'll have space today to think about vision and art making, particularly for the individual women gathered today in this conversation. So in trying to look at the vast expanse of different experiences and backgrounds, as well as national context on the panel, some of the talking points I gave them to maybe think about responding to or to reject entirely is to take, for example, the title of the panel at its word, this idea of feminist interventions. What does feminism mean to each of us personally? And how does it show up in our theater work, but also our practices or advocacy outside the theater? To really perhaps think into the intersections and the differences between Irish and US political and theater movements and industries. And for many of us on the panel, we've moved between those two contexts of Ireland and the United States. So what might we get from that? I've also asked us to think perhaps alongside the movements that we've mentioned in the call for today or the announcement of today. We're thinking about the Waking the Feminists, the gender equality-based theater movement in Ireland, Me Too and Time's Up, as ongoing iterations of sexual violence and gender equality movements, but also what would it mean to think about our work of feminism in relationship to, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement and the recent, upswelling again of that movement in this past summer, or even about feminism in relationship to anti-colonial movements that are contemporary, such as the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa, the UK, and elsewhere. I've also invited us to perhaps think about what the labor of work of doing feminist intervention as a theater maker, as an artist, as an activist means, something that I was really struck by in Lian Bell's foreword to the report from Waking the Feminists, initially in 2017, a report on an audit of the Irish theater industry. She talked of our need as a sector to keep counting. It's not enough to count once, as Jojo on this panel has also done through the festival that she will talk to us about. It's not enough to count once or do one audit, but we need to keep counting, keep working. But how do we deal as artist activists with being ground down, worn out? How do we keep up our labor? What are our strategies? And then finally, the last invitation I gave us to perhaps think about is we're saying that this is a panel about feminist interventions. We are talking about women in the theater, working in the theater, but what is the difference as well between a feminist piece of art versus having women working in the industry in the first place? How do we parse those distinctions and what might be the challenges there? And what does it mean as well to bring intersectionality into that conversation around gender and representation? So that's a lot that I've thrown at our panelists. We may get to some of it, all of it, or none of it today, but just to give you a sense, I suppose, of the variety of topics and ways in that we could take to what we're about to talk about today. But without further ado, we're going to go to the speakers now in the order listed. They will each contribute what we're calling an opening statement. I'll then ask a few questions to all of us to begin weaving those contributions together, as well as invite them to ask questions of each other. And then finally, we'll open out to our audience. So first up is Jojo Roof, who is the managing director currently of Theatre J. She has served as the managing director of the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics at Georgetown University for 4 years, for the National New Play Network for 5 years, serving also as well as the associate executive director there for 2 years. She was a coordinating producer for the 2015 Women's Voices Theater Festival, which I just mentioned, and has worked with Arena Stage, the Kennedy Center, Forge Theater, and the Provincetown Tennessee Williams Theater Festival. You're very welcome, Jojo, and you may have the floor.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. It's so delightful to be here. I'm zooming in from Washington, D.C., where, as Charlotte mentioned, I run a mid-sized theater here in the city, and had the great privilege back in 2015 to be one of the coordinating producers of the very first Women's Voices Theater Festival. So DC, for those that don't know, has over 90 professional theaters in the area. Their range, Solas Nua, of course, is one of them, They range from tiny theaters that produce 1 or 2 shows a year, all the way up to Arena Stage, the Kennedy Center, very, very large theaters. And the leaders from 7 of the largest theaters came together actually in 2013 or 2014, and they started talking about sort of the needs of the DC theater scene. At the time, The Count had just come out. This was basically looking at the gender parity of plays produced across the United States. It was run by 2 playwrights at the time. And in 2015, only 22% of the plays produced nationally were written by women. This was up by 5% since 2002. So back in 2002, it was 17% were written by women, but there was a real lack of gender parity on US stages of female playwrights. And so the artistic directors of the 7 largest theaters were sitting at a brunch actually, and decided to create the first Women's Voices Theater Festival. What happened is that only about 18 months later, 51 theaters came together. Over the course of 2 months, they produced 56 world premieres by female playwrights. There were actually a total of 58 female playwrights, because there were musicals, and so there were librettists and composers included in that count. And again, over the course of 2 months, 51 theaters produced 56 world premieres by female playwrights. And it was this pretty extraordinary event. It was really region-wide. The DC community extends into Maryland and Northern Virginia, and there were world premieres by these female playwrights. There were panel discussions. There was a huge kickoff event at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. There was a lot of press coverage, mostly to see sort of whether the needle would move. And there has been a DC somebody in DC, Gwydion Sullivan, who's kept a record of a lot of the gender parity, both in playwrights, but also in directors in DC. And in 2015, it was a little under 30% in DC were plays produced by female playwrights. And then the year of the festival, it peaked at 40%. And there was this like excitement that the Women's Voices Theater Festival had done something that, you know, we were creeping towards parity, and then sadly it dropped again, and since 2015 has not yet gone back up to even 40%, the number that it was the year of the festival. They decided to repeat the festival. So in 2018, they did another Women's Voices Theater Festival, because of course, as we know, the problem had not been solved. And at that point, only 24 theaters participated. It was a slightly stricter time frame. It was only about 4 weeks, and it could actually be new plays, not just world premieres. And at that point in 2018, the number was only 35% produced. Plays by women produced in Washington, D.C. And today it's down to 32%. So it's been, you know, I think one of the really interesting things is continued effort, right? So if all of this money and all of this time was put behind this festival in 2015 that had a real sort of peak in the number of female playwrights produced, but then does it really take another festival in order to keep the gender parity going? A couple other things that I just want to throw out there, and then I will turn it back to Charlotte to introduce the next panelist. So as she mentioned, I run a mid-sized theater here in DC, and one of the things I think a lot about is that there are very few female artistic directors. In DC, Arena Stage is run by a female artistic director. There's a handful of others, but very, very few. And actually nationally in the United States, of the League of Regional Theaters, of which there are 75 LORT theaters, only 23 are run by women, by female artistic directors. And so what does this mean for the field as we think about, you know, institutions being run by women, producing female plays, or plays written by female playwrights? How many directors are we hiring that are female? How many designers? And just that it takes a lot to sort of shift the narrative. the last thing I'll say before I turn it back to Charlotte is there's this incredibly depressing study that was done, which artistic directors read 2 different plays. One, and the plays were identical, but one was by Joe Smith and the other one was by Jane Smith. And even female artistic directors tended to choose the one written by a man. So what does that mean in terms of, you know, female leaders not trying to bring up other females? So I think it's a systemic problem. There's lots to talk about here. But Charlotte, turn it back to you, and eager for the rest of the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Jojo. Hugely illuminating. Yes, depressing, but I suppose having the numbers is where we need to start. So next, we're going to welcome to the virtual Zoom stage Lian Bell, who works as a set designer, cultural project manager, and artist. For over 20 years, she's worked with some of the most significant arts organizations and contemporary performance makers in Ireland. She was campaign director of #Waking the Feminists, the game-changing, and that is not an understatement, that is perhaps even still an understatement, grassroots campaign calling for equality for women artists in Irish theatre, which indeed has had impact throughout the creative industry sector in Ireland. She continues to consult, speak publicly, and run workshops on gender equality in the arts, nationally and internationally. Lian, you're very welcome.
Thanks so much, Charlotte, and thanks for having me. Just wish I could be there with you all instead of in my house. So I wanted to give a little bit of a kind of not a background on Waking the Feminists, but a kind of what Waking the Feminists has done in a very small nutshell. So Waking the Feminists itself happened, it was, as Charlotte said, a campaign for equality for women in Irish theatre, which ran for a year. From the end of 2015 to 2016, but it was part of a wider time of social change in Ireland, following on from the marriage equality referendum, just in advance of the referendum on abortion rights and the Me Too movement as it manifested in Ireland. So there was a kind of a chain of energy that ran between all of those movements and campaigns. It really is impossible to say how much of a sea change in Irish theatre has happened since the campaign. It's changed the way people think about programming. It's changed the way people feel like they can challenge programmers and people in places of authority. And it's had a really huge ripple effect into other sectors, not just cultural sectors, but around society as well. The campaign itself tried to focus really on governance and policy because we felt that's where the biggest change could happen. So for example, 10 of the major theatre organisations after the campaign worked together to put gender equality policies in place, which were published in 2017. And that's the first time that a cross-organisational group like that has ever happened. And that was something that directly came out of the campaign. And I was part of that group as well. As Charlotte said, we published some research. It was the first time there'd been a research done on gender equality or gender balance in Irish theatre. And that's available online. There's a link, I think, that just came up for you on that if you're interested in it. And then the same researchers in September just published, they worked voluntarily and published a little interim report to sort of see how things had changed or had things changed in the intervening 5 years. And again, there's a link for you in the chat, but they noted that there was an overall average increase of 23% in women in roles of the writer, creator, director, actor, set costume, lighting and sound designers, which is what they were looking at. And that's within 10 of the top theatre organisations in the country. There was one theatre in particular had a very significant shift, which is the Gate Theatre in Dublin, which is the second highest funded publicly funded theatre in the country after the National Theatre. And there are now 68% female directors, up from 8%, and 26% creators or writers, up from 6%. Another thing that happened was following a meeting with us at Waking the Feminists, the then Minister for the Arts asked all our national cultural institutions to put gender policies in place, which they did by 2017. Coming out of that is the Arts Council's Equality, Human Rights and Diversity Policy and Strategy, which was published in 2019, which is really significant because in Ireland, if you don't know, the arts is funded publicly. That's where the vast majority of the money for supporting theatre comes from. So the Arts Council is the main public funder, and having that kind of policy in place is having a knock-on effect across the arts sector, slowly but surely. The Waking the Feminists archives are now about to be, we've donated them to the National Library and to the National Museum, which means that the story of Waking the Feminists is now part of our national story, which was a really important part of kind of solidifying the legacy of the campaign. As for me, I was campaign director for the year. I hadn't been an activist or a campaign anything before that, so it was all very new to me. I'm still, as Charlotte said, involved in working in the areas of gender equality and diversity. I suppose we always said as part of the campaign that our feminism was intersectional feminism. And I suppose I'm now spending a lot more time with the word intersectional. I'm trying to learn a lot more. So at the moment, I'm doing a lot of listening, trying to work out where I can listen to people I don't normally get to hear. We talked in the campaign about how it wasn't just about getting women into positions of power. And this echoes something that Jojo just said. It's not just about getting women into positions of power, it's about getting feminists into positions of power. And I suppose now I'm concerned of broadening that out a little bit and wondering how people from diverse backgrounds can take up decision-making positions where they have agency and where they can direct the narratives. And I'm trying to work out what I can do to help make that happen as a white middle-class person working in theatre, which is in Ireland, the majority of people are working in theatre are white and middle class. And I suppose I'm sort of challenging myself by having difficult conversations or interesting conversations really with people who are artists working in Ireland and around Europe who come from I suppose minority backgrounds. I'm thinking a lot about words like exclusion. I'm thinking a lot about words like snobbery. I'm thinking about a provocation that an artist, a Black artist that I've been having conversations with gave me, which is your culture better than our culture? So within all that, I'm also trying to be strategic with my own energy, apart from being in a pandemic and being tired like everybody else. Activism takes energy, but not just the activism takes energy, learning from other people's activism takes energy. So I'm really fascinated by all the discourse that's come up around the Black Lives Matter movement and how that's echoing around the world and echoing in Ireland, but it's something that it does take energy to learn from. So those are the things that I'm concerned with right now. And I will pass it back to Charlotte for the next speaker. Thank you.
Yeah, and we can actually, I think, answer a question that's just come in on the chat. Was the Gates percentage increase contemporaneous with its new artistic director? And the answer was resounding.
Absolutely, yes.
And that new artistic director is Selena Cartmel, for those who don't know. So we can perhaps return to that later, but there's one question already answered. Fantastic. Okay, next up, we are going to have Deb Sivany, who is most well known as an award-winning costume and scenic designer from Washington, D.C., and has been a company member at Rorschach since 2006. She was a member of the second generation of the Welders, where she served as lead producing playwright for her work, Hello, My Name Is. She has received the Helen Hayes Award for Outstanding Scenic Design for Forgotten Kingdoms at the Rorschach Theatre and is a 5-time nominee for the award. You're very welcome, Deb.
Hello. Thanks so much, Charlotte. So I'm Deb Sivany, and I've been living and working in the DC area for about 20 years as both a costume and scenic designer, as well as an educator. Actually 11 years at Georgetown University and a few years recently at George Mason University. I've also worked regionally around the US, where I've been able to look at practices in other cities and chat with other designers about parity and intersectionality in our practice. And as Charlotte was giving us her prompts, I picked up on this prompt, asking what it means to balance pushing for representation of women and other marginalized groups on stage with how we do it. So my own entry point into this prompt is to look at race and how it intersects with feminism. So how great that Lian started to address intersectionality, and I would love to talk about that more. So I'm going to start more generally and then get more specific into the work that I've been involved with in the past couple of years. For example, one conversation that I've been part of many times in the past few years is conversations surrounding Black joy. And many theaters have produced plays that have given audiences stories about Black trauma, because theater centers around interesting conflict, and trauma is one of those things that is an oft traversed topic. People think, oh, you know, we want to empathize with people's pain, so we put that out there, and we will show stories where we are seeing pain happen on stage. So if the only evidence that we see of Black people on stage, for instance, is them being tortured, enslaved, or killed, what do we learn as audience members from this? We might feel pity, but it's not empathy. And we don't rush out and give reparations to the descendants of the enslaved. We don't know what to do. We're like, oh, that is nice, you know, like, oh, how tragic, you know, but then we sort of move on with our lives. So if producers stop thinking that just putting on a Black play or a play about any oppressed peoples, and put women inside this as well, it shows how far we've come as a society now that we're putting minorities on stage. Wasn't that enough? Isn't that enough? You know, like, wouldn't that be okay? So would the theater be in a place to be a social leader if it could sort of change its ways, you know, to sort of think about like what we tell audiences is something a little different? Are we going to change the perspective of our audiences by showing them, you know, that the theater is a place to learn and be challenged and encouraged to push audiences to self-educate? So if we only represent stereotypes of minorities on stage related to this, like this question of Black joy, and this very much includes women, we don't advance in our understanding of the nuances of gender, culture, and politics surrounding the bodies of the marginalized. We'll continue to perpetuate the cycle of misunderstanding, trauma, stereotype. So here's a smaller example of that. A few years ago, when I was working on my first somewhat autobiographical long form piece called Hello, My Name Is, which you'll see in the link in the chat, at the Welders, which is a playwrights collective here in DC, I learned that every body on stage is a representation, not only the bits and pieces of a real person, but a representation of something political and also something cultural. And every character in this play, as I worked with my cast and my designers on this, was every character found ways to subvert the stereotype to become a more complex individual, playing against expectation. It's the goal that we really want for everybody, but in this particular piece was very, very important to me. And while that piece was specifically about race and being Asian, not every piece that has people of color and it needs to center around their race. This is another way producers should think about how they represent race on stage. This wasn't how my writing began. It was actually not my intent when I set out to do this, but it's how it transformed in the process of doing the research and doing the work and determining, my God, the body is political. It can't not be that way. And two, the immersive nature of the play, it was set in a house, was meant to bring the audience into a direct mindset and interior life of transracially adopted people and challenge them to sort of question their own preconceived notions through voyeurism and their complicity in the action of the play. So it got down deep into audience members' souls. At least that was my goal. Why it became a political thing. I personally, as an artist and as a person in the world, I can't walk into a space without being stereotyped. And I knew that the same was true for my characters. East Asians and female East Asians in particular fight against a lot of generalities. We're exotic, we're submissive, quiet, either that or we're tiger mothers with fierce tempers, or maybe even seen in a more positive way, we work hard, we're diligent, we don't ask questions. But I have to grapple with all these things and all these sort of prior expectations, whether people think of them directly or not. And then I have to think about feminism on top of that. So the cards are double stacked against women of color because we can't hide our race and we can't hide the fact that we're women, at least for many of us. So I don't think about this directly on a daily basis, or at least I try not to spend a lot of time with it because it might get crushed by it. So instead, what I've been doing is channeling my efforts into working for equity for others through USA 829, which is the Union for Designers. I'm in a working group that's writing guidelines for costume designers in particular to ask for more resources and to ask for equal wages. You'd think we'd be there in this industry by now, but we are not, especially in costumes. Costumes is the area of design that is often seen as women's work, and being taken seriously in a room as the other team members can be a challenge. And I know this directly because I'm also a scenic designer and I'm treated very differently when I'm doing scenery. I have been quietly pointing out double standards in contracts, especially when I'm looking at both. I can very quickly point out, why does this happen over here and not over here? And trying to help theaters set better standards that often they're not even aware of, that they've made these sort of missteps over the years that acknowledge both labor issues and imbalance between wage. Finally, there's a group that's been at work in the DC area for a few years called Not in Our House, which I've been working with them to support victims of abuse in all forms in our theater community here in DC. And I'm really hoping that all of these efforts can help create a better, more inclusive community across the area and the nation. So those are some of our local goals on the individual level. And I will hand it back to Charlotte.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Deb, for detailing such huge experience and work, all the different work you're doing all over. Okay, so our last panelist that I'll introduce to you before bringing us all together for conversation is Grace Odumosu, who is the Youth in Engagement, Family Engagement Coordinator for Irish Community Services. She is an Irish-Nigerian actor and drama therapist born and raised in Dublin and emigrated to Chicago in 2014. She has an extensive background in theater, both in Dublin and Chicago. She's been working with children and young adults in the arts since she was 16. She holds a BA in acting from the Dublin Institute of Technology and a master's degree in drama therapy at NUI Maynooth. Grace, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And wow, what 4 great women to follow. So like Charlotte said, I am an actor and I am the Youth and Family Engagement Coordinator for Irish Community Services in Chicago. And so today I was actually having a conversation with my friend Hilary Williams, who is a wonderful actor and activist. Sometimes I find with big topics, I have too much to say. And so she helped me narrow it down. And I want to share some of that conversation with you now. To me, feminism is more than equality and a seat at the table. It's the ability to choose which table, what seat, and having the capability to bring more seats for others along with you. So, you know, we know that feminism is about being heard, but it's also about being listened to and about being trusted. It's about being advocated for, absolutely, but also about being an advocate. Feminism goes beyond the equality of the sexes. It doesn't work if it doesn't lift everyone up, regardless of sex, gender, sexuality, race, or ability. It's advocacy of women's rights on the basis of rights for all. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, the old idea of feminism just isn't enough anymore. You know, we have to broaden our terms of and our understanding of them. Otherwise, you know, we get stuck in a loop where some people are lifted up, which is great, but often people who look like me just aren't. So I have been an actor for a very long time, yet I have done very little work. I moved to Chicago in 2014 and I lived there for 6 years. The reason that I moved there was because I spent years here in Ireland, in Dublin, trying to, get some work and trying to, make my break, but there were no roles for a mixed race Irish actor then. I am so excited. I've learned so much tonight. I recently just relocated back to Ireland. That's where I am right now. But I've learned so much tonight about how the roles are opening up, and that people are opening up their spaces to gender equality. And now I think, like Lian was saying, it's time for more than that. So not just gender equality, but race equality. It's time for people to start writing roles for people who look like me and speak like me. There were roles that I was getting called in for that I just wasn't Black enough for. I never got called in for roles of white people. And then when I moved to the States, there were no roles for Black Irish people. So it's something that I think theater has the ability to open people's minds and to change people and to really affect them. And if we use all of this conversation that we're having right now to get a bigger, greater, grander, more open, more accepting theater that will uplift everyone, I think that the world is gonna change, and it's gonna be for the better. And with that little conversation there, I want to hand it back to Charlotte, because I'm really keen to talk to everyone, to have a discussion right now with the rest of the ladies on this panel.
Great, thanks so much, Grace. And so I invite Deb and Lian and Jojo to all turn back on their cameras so we can come here into our Hollywood squares. So I'll attempt now to formulate some kind of linking question or just thought, or anyone can jump in here, because so much has been shared. It strikes me just how much activity is going on and so many different fronts in each of our experiences. And maybe that's the place to start. I mean, I'm struck what you said, Grace, about, for you, the definition of feminism, it's the ability to choose our table, invite others to the table. But I suppose in order to make the kind of change that we're all fighting for in different ways, not only do we have to bring many people to the table, but we have to be at many different tables to pull the levers of change and keep pulling them to keep the thing rolling forward. I mean, the experience that you've shared with us, Jojo, of doing this huge festival, it moving the needle, but not even moving the needle, 56 new world premieres, and my goodness, still only at 40, and then the drop afterwards. So we got to be at all these tables, be pulling all these levers. And as Lian says, we're getting tired, right? Like there is energy expended there. We're in this together, but there is a lot of work to be done. I suppose where that's settling into a question for me is that all of us in some way in what we said are speaking about collectivity, that it's not just about the individual, it's about bringing others together. How can we continue to mobilize our sectors, both in terms of people who may be at a career level that is common across this panel, but also the younger people coming up through the industry, the people above us chairing boards, and how as well, I suppose, do we bring men and others into this conversation who may not be identifying with having to do the work to pull those levers? That's a big question. I guess I'll summarize it as, how do we keep pulling these levers, and who needs to come with us?
One of the things that I think about increasingly, because I am, I'm asked to speak at events that usually have gender in the title somewhere, and I'm increasingly aware of generally the people who are asked to speak at those events are women, which is who we are today, and also generally the people who turn up to them tend to be predominantly women. I mean, I can't see from the participants here, we can't see you guys, so I can't really tell. But it is my experience in the past that it does tend to be looking out at a sea of women with the few, men scattered around the back. And I'm increasingly tired of that, to be honest. And I'm increasingly getting slightly militant about the fact that I think men need to be more prominent and be speaking more about feminism, and that we need to A, put them on the spot, and B, empower them to be able to feel that they can speak about feminism. Because I think until we, women can't be the load bearers for this the whole time, because we will get tired. We do get tired. And generally speaking, I mean, the sweeping statement, but pretty true, men hold more positions of power. So we need them to be feminists. So that's one of my bugbears at the moment. And if anyone's got some great ideas about how to do that,
I think
please stick it in the chat window.
I think also it's about, like I said in my little spiel from my conversation with my friend earlier about, changing our understanding, and that comes to changing the male understanding of what feminism is. There's this poster board that feminism is this one thing that it's just completely not. And I think that's where that's how we get everybody on board, is by helping people to understand what actually is feminism, specifically what is intersectional feminism, what is that, and how do I take that on board, and what does that mean to me? And I think having these discussions, and also, there's however many of us right now having this conversation, if each one of us goes then and plants seeds in the minds of men and of younger kids and of people with disabilities and of just every lots of different people, we start planting all these seeds, and then things start to grow. So yeah.
It also makes me think that I think there's often this pressure that we put on ourselves, that I put on myself, that I think women put on themselves, of like the singular opportunity. There's like the glass cliff idea, right, where like women are basically only put in charge of institutions that are about to fail anyways. And Lisa Crone, so the Tony Award-winning playwright, she's written lots. She said at the opening event for the first Women's Voices Theatre Festival that she hopes one day there's as many bad plays by women produced as bad plays by men produced. That this idea that like all women don't have to be excellent, right? Like that you can promote someone, you can bring somebody up, and there's still this ability to fail. But I think I don't think in this moment there is quite that yet. I don't know that we've reached that point yet. And I think talking about intersectionality, like, I talked a lot about like the number of LORT theaters run by women, like the number of LORT theaters run by non-white people is like abysmal. I mean, I think it's like 7 or 8. It's really small and might even be smaller than that. And so, that certainly lumping like women and people of color all together is incredibly problematic. And also we need to think about like the ways in which we can bolster each other and invite people up and mentor and just sort of bring more people into the conversation. Like, let's have a bigger tent so that more people can be involved.
Yeah, it's definitely less than 10. I think that there is that incredible pressure to perform, to be perfect, and to be perfect on the way in. And I think in a way that women often get blamed for it not being why isn't it perfect? Well, it was perfect when the man who was running this organization before was here. And I'm like, well, might be a reason he's gone. I don't know. We're not talking about that very much. And so the woman, or gosh, the woman of color who's brought in to replace him suddenly is stuck, under these standards that are often invisible to that person, and no one is telling them that, and there's no one underneath them to support them in any real way. So like the sounding boards are gone, the safety net is gone, and yet the pressure to be excellent is like paramount to everyone around them. And that's, I think, where it's deeply problematic in the field too. So
I just fact checked myself. It's 6 people of color running LORT theaters.
Okay. Yeah, and I think 3 of them are women. Is it half? Something like that.
Yeah.
It's abysmal.
And I think so I want to grab onto that term excellence as well, both in terms of excellence, in terms of how we define the values of a piece of work of art, in terms of what gets funding, in terms of how an organization runs, the invisible or predetermined standards that set up those kinds of processes or institutional rules. I mean, to me, a central tenet of the intersectional feminist way of looking at the world is that we're constantly calling into question those ideas around excellence and breaking it apart. I think something we have seen play out very clearly in Ireland when it comes to the work of minority, ethnic, and migrant artists over the last 20 years is the way that we had an arts policy 10 years ago, the cultural diversity in the arts policy that was supposed to be tackling all these issues that never really went anywhere, that tied cultural diversity to arts participation, skilled artists working with non-skilled artists, and always kind of defining artists from minority and migrant backgrounds as kind of coming up not professional enough, right? So the standards of excellence of professional end up then really dividing the theater scene in things in a way that has played out over 20 years in my own experience and my own opinion. So there's that way that we need to keep looking at excellence, redefining that. There's also the issue of time scales that strikes me in what everyone's talking about, because whether it's the experience of Jojo, where we have the two festivals where there's an infusion into the scene of 50, 20 new plays coming on. But I remember reading in one of the reviews that you said on Jojo, then part of the critique was, well, are some of these plays not ready yet? So we're either trying to flood the market, but if we flood the market and everything's not perfect, then that's the reason not to produce a play later down the road. So we're always in this long game, but the news cycle and our own energy gets worn out, and we need a new festival, a new movement to keep people trained on gender equality. So it seems to me that, I suppose, like, thinking about time and waves of time within the feminist movement and the organizing we do is really important, because there is always kind of this wall that we run into in terms of energy, because change takes time, right? So how do we keep that pushing forward, and how do we stand up to challenge these standards of excellence, which are either overt or hidden? So to me, that seems to be a key part of the work as well.
I don't really have an answer, certainly in the question about excellence, but it's something I'm really interested in. And I think it also calls into question, what is theatre? Mm-hmm. What are the boundaries of what we define theatre to be? Because I think a lot of artists who haven't found a place in what we consider theatre are making work that's adjacent to theatre, mm-hmm. And is a really interesting space, and is a really, there's audiences for it, and there's hunger for it, but for some reason we in the sort of established theatre community, of which I consider myself to be one of those, are considering theatre in a very sort of restrictive kind of a way. And I'm interested in seeing how the established theatre community opens that up in a way that doesn't, like, I think the big fear is that if we open up theatre, it's about giving away power, basically. It's about sort of saying, I don't have control over this thing, that, I'm the big fish in the small pond here. But if suddenly the pond gets big, then, like, fuck, what am I? Excuse my language. It's after, what's the watershed time in Ireland has passed, maybe not in America, sorry. But yeah, so I do think about that a lot. And I don't know if I have an answer yet, but I do feel like one of the good things about the pandemic, if I can say that there are good things about the pandemic, but one of the things that has happened in the last year is giving people time and space to think about, I suppose, to take time and step back and look at the theatre community a bit more broadly. And while everything's on pause and nobody has access to anything, or very few people have access to anything, my feeling is that there's a lot of people working who are in positions of power in venues and festivals and so on, who are really thinking about the diversity part at the moment. And my hope, like being an eternal optimist, is that when things start to ramp up again, there will be more people having more access. than there were previously. And I think that's actually happening because the conversation is really, I'm sure it's prevalent in the US as well, but it's really prevalent conversation here among the arts community about making sure that other people, other voices have space on the stage, really, and that they aren't just put on the stage in a role, but that they have authorship, which I think is really hugely important.
Just to kind of, I guess, piggyback on that, I wanted to kind of tell a little story. When I was 14, I went to see one of my first professional productions of The Plough and the Stars, Sean O'Casey, and completely and utterly fell madly in love with the play, the story, and since that night, seeing it, dreamed of playing Nora. I think I auditioned for it once, and of course did not get the role because, you know, there was never going to be a black or mixed race Nora. And it's still with me. I still have that dream, and I still I'm putting that out into the universe, out into the energy, out into the world. Like, one of these days I am going to play a black Nora in The Plough and the Stars. And I guess the reason that that I wanted to bring that story in is to, I guess, showcase that, like, we need like Lian just said, what is theater? Like, we have theater in this little box that it's not. It's bigger than that box, and I think it's going to take the people who are in charge of this box to let go and to open up that box and to allow for theater to be what it is supposed to be, and that is a place of transformation, a place of change, a place of wonder, a place to experience, a place to see, a place to be, and a place to be whatever you are versus, you know, what we think it should be. Like, there's, you know, if Nora's in 1916 Dublin, Ireland, she should be white. Why?
Absolutely. Beautifully said and well said, Grace. There's two questions that have come in here that I might just bring to the panel and then move it back, I think, to the Washington, D.C. focus a bit. So it builds on this. I suppose this question is for Lian, but it can be for Grace and I as well. Do we have examples of theater adjacent companies, performers, performances that we in the theater community can embrace?
I think there's places to look in Ireland. I mean, I don't know. You know, I've been to the US twice in my life, so I feel like a complete. I have no idea what's going on over there. Sorry, but in terms of Ireland and in terms of, I suppose, Dublin, which is where I'm based, there's places to look where there are people making work that I think are really interesting and are maybe not breaking through or getting onto main stages. So places like Dublin Fringe Festival, places like Live Collision Festival, which happens once a year, which is, I suppose, a more live art space. Corja Festival in Sligo, Cork Midsummer Festival in Cork. So I think there are places where there are artists who are testing things out. And when I say theatre adjacent, like, it might be people working in spoken word, might be people working in music. Ireland has had a little bit of an explosion of Black Irish musicians. Just even in the last year, suddenly they're so much more visible, they're so much more lauded than they were before, which is fantastic. And I'm interested, I suppose, one of the other questions I have is around why there is more diversity in things like music and even in dance to a degree. And what one of my theories, it's totally my own theory, I don't know if it's true, is about the accessibility of theatre, of actually getting to see theatre, so that, you know, a young person in particular can take their phone and listen to great music and watch dance on it. and then can make something of their own relatively easily with whatever equipment they have. To see theatre, it generally is a paid experience that you have to go to somewhere. And then to make theatre, you need to have your tribe with you. You need to have people around you. And I don't know yet if there is a critical mass of people, young people wanting to make theatre who come from, you know, the Black Irish community or the traveller community in Ireland. And I don't know if that they've found each other, if there is enough of them.
I think that's exactly it. That's the nail on the head. You know, you're talking about the Black and Irish explosion that's happened in the last year, and I would implore everyone who's watching to jump on the Black and Irish Instagram page. Those guys are doing some amazing work showcasing people who are of color and are Irish, artists, musicians, dancers, writers, actors, you name it. These people are being showcased, and you know, I grew up in Dublin, and I'm lucky enough that I have 3 siblings. But outside of that, you know, we were kind of we thought we were the only people, because, you know, there's such a disconnect, and everybody is just so surrounded by, or was back then at least, surrounded by whiteness, that we never really got to break through and to connect with each other. And I think one of the good things about, you know, the Black and Irish movement and this conversation even right now is that, like, there maybe is somebody out there who's like, oh, she could be in my tribe, or, you know, all of these little tiny connections that we are now facilitating. I think it's, you know, it's great.
So I'm going to say 3 really brief things drawing on this, and actually give an example of a film that was co-commissioned by Project Art Centre in Dublin, which is a performance poetry film that actually came out last night, which has the poet, the young Nigerian Irish poet, Feli Speaks, as well as other collaborators within it, which I think is an example of, and Feli Speaks is great. Felicity is someone who's rising up at the scene at the intersection of art and hip hop and theater. So to check this out, it's open air to the world. So that would be one example. I think as well, within dance and dance theater in Ireland, because of the need of people to go abroad and train and people coming from abroad to collaborate, that's why we've seen within Irish theater, that's been one of the more diverse spaces in the last 20 years. And I think then finally, as an example from the UK, perhaps as instruction to us all, there's a brilliant woman and activist, Nassim Khan, who wrote the first British Arts Council report, The Arts Britain Ignores, in I think the early 80s. And the way that she got the data and found the artists was by mailing out surveys to big art centers, but going on the ground and finding where were the Bollywood film screenings, where were people doing weird political devised theater in a back room. And she got a much fuller landscape once she looked beyond excellent and professional in the way that up till then had been defined by the British Arts Council. So I think that's a story that we can learn from. So for Jojo and Deb, having lived and worked in the States within the regional theater sector, I know that often the production pressures around the way in which works get produced, the financial side of it, you know, entertainment versus more political art or high theater, you know, the constraints that you may be facing as theater makers working in your area may be different. So I suppose, how do things like profit, the privately funded nature of theater and so on, play on to these kinds of goals that we're trying to talk about and work towards?
Jojo, take it away.
Yes, great question. Yeah, I mean, I used to work for an international theater company, and would go to places like the UK and Canada and Australia and Ireland, and I think both envy the amount of support they get from the government. On the other hand, I think our sort of history of private philanthropy is radically different in the United States than it is in a lot of other countries, which I think at the end of the day sometimes gives a little freedom. So, you know, but most theaters in the US are reliant on both contributed revenue, so grants, individual donations, as well as earned revenue, so ticket sales. And I think that there, that certainly comes into play with sort of the produced by a female playwright or plays by a female playwright. I think there's a misperception here. I think, the festival is a good example. I mean, there was a lot of competition, a lot of plays happening at the same time, but like a lot of these plays sold out and they were great, right? And so like you can still make earned revenue even if the play is written by a woman. I think truthfully, at the end of the day, this is dependent on the size of the theater more than anything else, and like how reliant they are on earned revenue. I think these statistics, like it's worth noting, are slightly skewed because most produced plays before 1950, 1980, like most of them were written by men to begin with. Not to say there aren't, plays written by women in the 18th century or 17th century, but a vast majority were written by men. And so theaters like the Shakespeare Theater here in DC, it's skewed because they're doing a lot of plays written by William Shakespeare. That being said, I think like there is an opportunity, and Deb, I'm curious your thoughts, knowing how many different places that you've worked in DC and elsewhere, that to not sort of think of the plays written by women as sort of a box to check, much like you don't have to produce a play written by a Black playwright in February. Think about it sort of more broadly and think about audiences you're welcoming in rather than sort of, things you have to like hold your nose and get through in order to get to the rest of your season.
Right. I think the notion of how that sort of comes down and hits production where I feel it the most is time is money. And the time spent, I'm thinking particularly like the time spent in tech or the weeks spent in rehearsal. They vary greatly on, on the size of the theater. I have worked at regional theaters that have, had a luxurious 4-week rehearsal period. I've also worked at regional theaters that are like slam it up in 2, we'll work 8 hours a day, and then we go straight into tech. And like they're, how money sort of manifests, I think, sits primarily, at least for me, on like how fast do I have to work and what kind of process can I have in this. And so it's interesting, during the Women's Festival I worked a lot. I think I touched on 5 shows in 2 months. It was obviously way too much work, but I think everybody wanted a female designer and everybody wanted a female designer of color, and then there are even less female scenic designers. So I was working very steadily, a very exciting time, but also you spill out of those weeks just in time for like Asian American Heritage Month to show up, so I was so tired those years. But knowing that that's what sort of had to be done to promote representation for in all those ways, in all those places, again, the sort of pressure. I had another point, now it has left my brain, so I'll just hand it back to you, Charlotte. It'll come to me.
Not that these busy, brilliant feminists have more that they need to be doing or reading, but I would recommend this book, Living a Feminist Life by Sarah Ahmed, who is she's a British, a Black British feminist, philosopher, thinker, academic, but this book actually is written in a more autobiographical, less academic style, working with only citing female thinkers, but a lot of it is about the labor and the work of activism, what it means to burn out, what it means to keep pushing, how to theorize that within an intersectional feminist experience. And so much of what is coming up here today about the work that keeps needing to be done, and then how do we do it, but also still live a life, really resonates with a lot of themes there. So I'd give that to all of you as an offering. It's something to read as soul food to dip into in and out there as we move forward. So I'm going to go to some of the questions from the audience here, just to bring other people into the conversation as well a little bit. So Lian, here's an interesting one, and Grace, you may have thoughts on this as well. So the Gate Theater had problems, which did not actually directly lead to Selena Cartmel coming in as artistic director. That, kind of the two processes, I suppose, dovetailed. So the question is, that had problems, led to a positive result. Are there any experiences that we have in Ireland, or perhaps to open that up, where, you know, the issues that are endemic within the industries perhaps lead to change or end up being next to change that is ultimately good? So how can we make an opportunity perhaps out of things that went wrong within our sector?
Yeah, the Gate Theatre is a particular, I suppose I pulled that out as a statistic because I suppose it's the most extreme change that's happened over those 5 years. The Gate is a particular case study in the sense that it was also the man who was the director of the Gate before the current director, Selena, who's the one who has sort of made those huge changes in terms of programming. The man who was the director previous to her and was the director for the previous 33 years of the Gate's history was also at the absolute epicenter of the Me Too movement, or not the, he wasn't at the center of the movement, he was at the center of the finger pointing during the Me Too movement in Ireland. So it really was a kind of it was interesting. I think, Deb, you were talking about that idea, or Jojo, you mentioned the idea of the glass cliff of like handing female directors an organization that then that's in trouble. So I really felt for Selena, who has done an incredible job of being handed a theatre, only to have the Me Too movement explode about her predecessor, and then face into a pandemic and have to deal with just the reality of a closed theatre and so on. I think, like I said, across the board in Ireland, in those 10 organisations that we looked at, the upward trend has been really significant. I do think the Abbey, the National Theatre, has done a really strong job of changing and not just talking about women, but actually now opening up like roles for people of color and all kinds, you know, just that there's a little bit more diversity being seen on the national stage than there ever was before. But I can't think of anything that was as dramatic a change as the Gate. I don't know if there's been anything that's been a kind of a turnaround organization in the US that you guys can think of.
Yeah, then I think, you know, well, we're back to that question of time, and what is the time? Like, that's such a radical example. The Gate, it certainly is an outlier, and other change takes more time, I suppose. There was a question. So
the great thing that Selena did, I think, you know, apart from actually changing the statistics so drastically, was when Waking the Feminists kicked off, there was lots of conversation, and I'm sure you guys hear this all the time, of like, yeah, but are there any women writers? Like, are there any women directors? Like, where are they? You know, and I can see Deb rolling her eyes. Yeah. So Selena just went, boom, there they are. I'm bringing them in, you know. So she really just showed that it can be done. When there's a will, there's a way. Like, she just did it. So I think that sort of leading by example was an exceptional job that she did. And kind of, there's no arguing with that then. Like, there's no kind of like, oh, well, we couldn't find them. It's like, well, she found them. So, you know, tough luck. You guys have to sort it out. So, yeah. I'm getting, it's late here, so I'm getting really like blasé the way I'm talking about this, but anyway.
So people have been coming into the chat from the audience, but I want to explicitly open the audience here now as we're moving into like the last 20 minutes or so of this, to come in with thoughts or questions based on your experience, whether in Ireland, the States, or indeed elsewhere. I would comment that one of the things that struck me so much, Lian, about a particular moment in Waking the Feminists, I can't read, anyway, that kind of from the outset, or at a particular moment, there was the goal of 50-50 in 5 years, right? And 23 is a pretty damn good place to get in 5 years. But that kind of call of 50-50 in 5 years of course, it would have been great if it happened, but even if it happened, we would have had to sustain it. But there was the utopian, there was the bold, there was the saying in plain language and simply the message of where we wanted to get. I suppose at this moment, in the pandemic, in the political turmoil that we all are living through, continue to live through in the world, what are our utopian hopes or messages that we would like to call for, or that we might call for at this time?
I think, sorry, I'm getting slightly distracted by some of the stuff that I was reading there. I think, you know, we all wish we had a switch that we could flip and boom, you know, it's equality for all races are on the same level, you know. We all wish we had that switch that we could flip, but you know, it just doesn't exist. This has been so long in the making of, you know, pushing people down, certain people pushing women down, that the gap is just so large that to make that leap, yeah, it would be amazing, but there's the potential that you would make that leap and fall flat on your face. And so I think, for me anyway, the hopes are that we continue to build and we continue to grow and we take that step by step. And, you know, 23%, I'll take that. Next year I'll take 25%, 20, you know, and we'll just keep going. We'll keep going. And as we come up, you know, hopefully the people who are at the top will start to see, rather than, you know, getting scared, being like, these women are coming at us, or these Black people are coming at me, you know, come to meet us. And so we can eventually bridge the gap together.
Mm.
Lian, you said something earlier just about what was afforded during this moment of COVID and where everything's shut down. I think certainly, you know, as someone who's running a theater and has furloughed 50% of my staff, one of the things I realized, or we recognized that had already happened, is that the US theater is built on the backs of artists, right? The reason we're able to do this, and I furloughed more than 50% of my staff, because if you think of all of the artists and stage managers and technicians that were not hired for our seasons, it's a much, much larger. And I think that was in a city like DC, where, you know, we have the government and we have a whole lot of theaters too, that there's lots of artists living here who are really struggling. And so I think, you know, there was this document that came out, We See You, White American Theater, which was written by a group of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, basically making a list of demands for the majority white US theater. And it was an incredibly long 36-page document, which was basically like free consulting hours given out to all of the theaters about what they can do better and how they can be more inclusive and anti-racist and anti-oppressive. I'm eager to see sort of what happens when we go back, because of course we're all rebuilding audiences. We're not going to be able to just sort of flip a switch and go back to what happens before. So how do we welcome these female playwrights into our seasons? How do we reflect what the list of demands came from We See You, White American Theater, from these Black, Indigenous, and people of color? And also, how do we support our staff? How do we balance the contributed and earned revenue? I think it basically requires like a leap and a move forward and a trust on the back of our donors and on the back of grants and the National Endowment for the Arts. But I also imagine there's going to be theaters that are scared, and so they rest their laurels on musicals that have sold well in the past, or plays that have done well and have a New York Times review to go along with it. So I think it's a moment of fear, I'm sure, for everybody, but also a moment to sort of run into the fire.
Mm.
It's true. It's a time where choices will have to be made. I think one thing that I'm thinking a lot about is sort of standard bearers, and will the standard bearers come down off their hills to meet the people that are coming up? Yeah, I think Grace's sort of analogy of that is huge, because some are going to remain on their high hills and they're like, no, we are not coming down, and they'll either stick their heads in the sand, or they'll be sand. They'll dig their heels in harder, or they'll stick their heads in the sand. And those theaters might die. Some of those theaters will die. And I think that, you know, yeah, it's hard to say like, oh, well, the positive of the pandemic, but we see White American theater, that conversation has been happening in rooms for 2 decades. It's just like with the pandemic, with Black Lives Matter, with the explosion of politics in the US, like this was going to be the moment. And the pandemic was just the pause that movement needed for everyone to get together and go, wait a minute. This is the power we have. And so I don't think that would have happened without this pause. So yeah, like Jojo, I'm very curious to see what's going to happen when we all come back. The onslaught of work, and then all the people that I know, myself included, are going to be like, no, I will not do that anymore. And now I feel empowered, sort of in the past 2 years of this language sort of coming up, feeling empowered to say no. In most of my career as an individual artist, I've been living in fear, and I have not said no to things. And now I'm like, you know what? This is my rider. These are my standards. And if you can't meet that, I am not coming to work for you.
That's really strong. That's really powerful, Deb. And as you were speaking, and as Jojo was speaking, one of the things that I was thinking on, and one of the main things that feminism and all the complexity of intersectional feminism has given me as a gift, but I don't know if it's a gift with which we're going to sell the movement, is that we need to be comfortable with discomfort and to sit in that these conversations, whether it's we see White American theater, whether it's the ongoing audits that we're asking for through the legacy of Waking the Feminists, or any of these, there is a kind of sitting with discomfort, you know, allowing things to settle, to watch a shift in priorities or programming happen, and some of it is going to work and some of it's not going to work. But then there are also still the bottom lines of the theater, the different needs of the operating houses, or the kinds of houses, as you have pointed out, Deb and Jojo, and that we experience across the Irish theater. These are a lot of things to balance. It does not all fall on our shoulders, but I do think like that you know, actually, if COVID has taught us anything, the comfort, not that we are all experiencing comfort to differing degrees based on our level of privilege, our job, etc. But sitting with discomfort perhaps can lead us somewhere productive in the end. I'm just going to check over here in terms of the questions that are in from the Q&A. Are there anything? I think we've met because we just talked. We've touched on the question. Okay, on that question. So as we move here, perhaps towards winding up, you know, many of us have met each other for the first time here tonight, had a wide-ranging conversation. What are some things that each of you are leaving here thinking about or wondering about? Maybe.
I don't have an answer for this question, but I'm sad I don't have an answer for how do we sort of bring more women in. I'd like to like come up with that answer, but the idea that that how do we recruit, how do we promote, how do we mentor, how do we do it? How do we bring the feminists in?
Yeah, I think I'm sitting at this table of like, you know, like what you said about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And, you know, for example, like I said earlier about, you know, certain people being lifted up and you know, making that stand and saying, okay, yeah, you lifted me up, and now, okay, what does the rest of the room look like? And if the rest of the room does not look like a place where you actually feel like you're uplifted, like you feel there are other people around you who are also, or are you just that token? Are you just that one person so they can say, look, we did it, see, pat on the back, yay, you know? And that's where I think women are going to have to start saying, like you said, saying no, you know, this is not enough. It's not enough to just uplift me and give me this space, and that might be hard for people because, you know, as women, and especially myself as a woman of color, you know, I've been fighting my whole life to try and find a space and to try and find a table where, you know, I feel welcome at, and I feel like I can contribute and sit at, and I feel like the people around me are valuing me. But if I don't see other people who look like me around in the room, I'm going to have to say no. And unfortunately for the people who wanted me to be at the table, that's, you know, that's just, that's where I stand. And I think that's something that, you know, the women and people who are watching us and who are in this room with me right now should also take on board. You know, if you walk into a room and you don't see that representation, you know, you walk yourself right back out.
Yeah, I sort of following up on that, I think it's something that that really came home to me during Waking the Feminists, and I sort of periodically forget and then come back to, which is about how much power we all have, particularly those of us who've gotten to a certain stage in our career, a bit like Deb says, where you can sort of put your foot down a little bit, which can be really scary the first 1 or 2 times you do it, but then you realize, oh no, I do have a bit of power here. But also I'm interested in the power that audiences have, and the power that I saw happening around Waking the Feminists, and in the sort of immediate aftermath of it in particular, where festivals around the country, nothing to do with theatre as well, would put up programs and would straight away be questioned by their audiences of, you know, why are there no women in this program? And I would love to see that happening more. And I would also love to see the questions being asked about, you know, why are there no artists of colour being programmed? Or why are there no artists of colour being involved in any of these productions? And I think in Ireland in particular, because, you know, people of colour are in such a minority. And it's not just about people of colour, you know, we are talking about diversity in all its forms. So, you know, people who have disabilities, people who are coming from the traveling community, generally, okay, people with disabilities is actually quite a large group of people, but the other groups of people are quite small. So it does have to be those of us who aren't from those communities asking those questions, and, you know, saying, why aren't these people being represented? And I think asking the question to power is a very strong thing to do. So if there's something that anybody in the sort of virtual room is thinking about what they can do in the wake of all this, I think, you know, asking questions of your programmers, looking at festivals, looking at venues and going, you know, once they're able to program anything again, going and asking, like, you know, why isn't this representative of our community?
I think that's really key, is asking questions, and theaters and institutions allowing artists to ask questions without fear of retribution, you know, without fear that they'll never, of retaliation, that they'll never work again. If I bring up that you are missing this entire group, that, oh, maybe even this play is about, they're not here, that's problematic, that theaters will actually say, oh gosh, that's a good point. Maybe we should not program this. Maybe we should look at something else, or maybe we should work, you know, doubly hard to get those people in the room and set those things up before putting those productions together and promoting them. Yeah, and not having diversity just for the sake of diversity, or women for the sake of women, you know, and then treating them in one way. I remember the thing I was going to say long before, but like the processes that I have been with in a group of women, like during the Women's Festival, were extremely different than the processes that I've been in with a mixed gendered room, in terms of their creation spaces and in terms of, you know, just how things get made. And I think that we should actually really question, why is that? What is it about spaces with all women that somehow, for me as another woman, work better? I don't know what it is. It's a je ne sais quoi, but I really think that we should actually try to unpack that. Why are spaces with people of color who represent the thing that you're working on, why are they better? Because they are. They always are, because you're looking at a piece of life, a piece of experience that is really personal to making that art.
That's beautifully said, Deb. And I suppose I almost want to let those words stand, because I think that that's at the heart of what we've been trying to talk around here and to think about. And perhaps the only thing that I would say as well, before we move on to closing and actually engaging in a ritual here together, coming from within the Irish theater community that I'll talk about in a moment is, I was very lucky to be in the room the day of the first Waking the Feminists meeting. And one of the things that I remember I was so excited by was not only that it was happening, was not only at the number of women on stage and in the theater, but also that from the beginning that the movement was connected to looking at the way in which it was not only the job of theater to solve these problems within Irish society. We had Ivana Bacik there the very first day. I remember Tanya Dean, who then went on to be one of the report co-authors, talking about, the barriers for women getting into political life and how that's connected to what's happening in the theater. It's not only on theater to solve these problems as a visible industry, as a visible, often we are looked at as the place that reflects real life on the stage. But what we're talking about and engaged in is the job of wider societies as well. And I think we all know that, but it's, the pressure, I suppose, to solve or to understand can sometimes feel quite heavy. So when we're trying to bring those women into the room, as Jojo is saying, what is keeping them from getting there in terms of socioeconomic belonging, disability, in terms of childcare, what is stopping people from even getting in the door, let alone things happening once we're in the room, is important to keep in mind. So tonight, to close, before I hand this back to Rex here for a sign off. So firstly, thank you to the audience for your participation, for your gift of time and attention during this. We have a tradition in Ireland that the day that someone from our performing arts community passes, there's a final standing ovation dedicated to them at the end of whatever productions are on that night. In the last 3 days, we've lost 2 female artists who were very much at the heart of our arts community. And Lian and I Lian had written to us and asked me to ask that we consider here engaging in this ritual together on Zoom to honor Rhina O'Grady and Emma O'Kane. Rhina O'Grady was an actress who was known for her work with the Abbey Theatre over many decades, and you may have recognized her as Mary on the popular show Father Ted. Emma O'Kane, dancer and choreographer, was a core member of Cushkeen Dance Theatre for 2 decades, and she had worked in collaboration with other companies from the Abbey and Project Art Center, where she was an artist member, to companies like Rough Magic, Fishamble, and Anu across a diverse array of projects. Reading these few lines about their contributions in their life in no way captures their spirit. We'll drop some references to their work here in the chat afterwards, but can I ask all of us to consider engaging in a live ritual together of standing up and giving them one more round of applause. Thank you. In a time where it's difficult, we in Ireland, we're not allowed to gather. Our funerals are limited to 10 people. Thank you for sharing in that with us, and nice to actually get to clap for something together once again. So over to Rex, and thank you, women.
Hi, thank you again so much, all of you, to this amazing panel, and to the audiences who tuned in. And I just want to piggyback of something of what Lian said, and Deb as well, of how important it is as producers to hear from audience members, and particularly in this time when we don't get that sort of post-show live moment where we get to check in, or like, what do you think of the show? How are you? Good to see you again. So in solidarity with what our panelists were saying, my email is rex@solasnua.org. It would be so great to hear from you. Send me an email of, hey, I want to see more of this at Solas Nua. I would be delighted to hear from that. I'm going to drop that into the chat here, but I know it'll go away at the end of this. But that should... it's just rex@solas, oops, sorry, not .com, .org. Typing and talking at the same time. solasnua.org. That is me. Please give a shout. I wanted to let you know about 2 other things that are coming up at Solas Nua. real quick, February 21st at 3 p.m., we are presenting Hecuba by Marina Carr with a post-show discussion with celebrated Irish actor Dervla Crotty, who plays the title role. Hope you can join us for that. This is a new partnership that we've launched back in January with RTE Drama on One. So this is a radio drama of Marina Carr's Hecuba. And then finally, our 15th annual Capital Irish Film Festival, presented in partnership with AFI Silver Spring, is running March 4th through 14th. Tickets and passes are on sale now. And our films this year include the Irish language film Iraq and Wolfwalkers, which was just nominated for a Golden Globe. Hope you can join us for these events and more. Thank you again to this inspiring, igniting conversation with all of these panelists, and I hope we are continuing this conversation into the future. And send me an email if we are not. So thank you again, and hope to be in touch.